What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. You ever take a picture and wonder, why is it so dark? Why is it so blurry? How come it came out so bright? Well, there's a good chance that shutter speed is responsible for that. That being said, today I'm breaking down exactly what shutter speed is, how it works, and how you can use it to get sharper images or freeze motion. And we'll talk about how it ties into things like exposure or motion blur and which settings to use in which different situation. So let's jump right into it. And hopefully by the end of this video, you'll have a solid understanding of what shutter speed is and how to use it like a pro. Shutter speed refers to how long your camera's shutter stays open to let light hit the sensor. That's it. It's quite literally the duration of the camera seeing the scene. And it's measured in seconds or fractions of a second. For example, 1/1000th sounds like this. It's really fast. And if you stop that down to say 1/30th of a second, it sounds a little more like this. That's a little slower. And if you bring it down to say 1 full second, then it sounds more like this. That was a whole Mississippi right there. So during that Mississippi, the sensor was exposed, letting the light hit the sensor for all of that time, as opposed to the fraction of a thousandth of a second. So essentially, the faster the shutter speed, the less light actually gets into the sensor, and the more likely you are to freeze any movement you might be photographing. The slower the shutter speed, the more light will hit the sensor, but because the sensor is exposed for a longer amount of time, you risk getting motion blur in the image. Now let's talk exposure. Shutter speed is essentially just one part of the exposure triangle, alongside aperture and ISO. The longer the shutter stays open, the more light gets into the image, resulting in a brighter image. Open up your aperture or bump up your ISO, but we're gonna save that stuff for a different video. Right now we're just focusing on shutter speed. Although I will say, anytime you adjust your shutter speed, you're probably gonna have to adjust your aperture and your ISO as well to balance out the exposure triangle to ensure you get a properly exposed image. It's not like you can just kind of move one dial and fix whatever the issue is. You have to learn how to use all three things in tandem to really get a properly exposed image. I feel like I've been saying that a lot, properly exposed image. Am I saying it too much? We're talking about properly exposing an image, so bear with me. Now, one of the biggest reasons to understand shutter speed and how it works is how it handles motion. If you're shooting a fast-moving object, like say a car, or I don't know, an athlete, or in my case, a bird, then you're gonna want a faster shutter speed, something like 1000 or higher to ensure you get a nice, crisp, frozen image, which can be challenging depending on how fast the subject moves. Now, if you want to challenge yourself, go outside and find yourself some small birds in flight, because those wings are fast. I'm talking 3000 shutter speed or higher, and even still, I mean, good luck trying to focus on them. That's its own thing, but I digress. If you're shooting a subject that is moving slow, or even let's say something that isn't moving at all, but your shutter speed is too slow, say 1/30th, 1/15th, 1/10th of a second, that might be too slow, and the slightest movement, even just you breathing, could actually cause some motion blur in the image, which is sometimes unwanted, but at times you can use it creatively. The important thing is knowing how and when to use those techniques. But if you're just kind of shooting at random and half your images look blurry, I'd be hard pressed to call that a creative decision as opposed to just a bad photo, I guess, you know? An example of using motion blur in a creative way is if you've ever seen a photo of maybe a waterfall or a flowing stream of water, but the water looks like silky, like smoke or something. That's done with a longer exposure. I think I have an image of myself. I'll post it right here if I can find it. It's of a lighthouse in Maine where I shot on maybe like a 20-second exposure to get the water below the lighthouse really looking smoky and crisp and cool looking. And you can use that same technique to do things like light painting, where you have maybe a car riding through the middle of the street and you have the tail lights kind of tailing behind them. Or some people even use a little laser pointer and they like to draw in midair. And people can get pretty good at that stuff. You know, I've done it. I'm not an artist, an air artist, a light artist, whatever you want to call it, but you can get pretty creative with things like that. It's just a matter of understanding how to use your settings and how to use those settings to help tell a story. And something like shutter speed can help introduce motion that enhances the storytelling abilities of the photo. Now, like I said, it's not just a subject that can introduce the blur to the image, it can also be you. If your shutter speed is too slow, and for whatever reason you're moving around, even if it's just the motion of you breathing, depending on the shutter speed, that can cause camera shake, which in turn will cause image blur. Now, the general rule of thumb is whatever focal length you're shooting at, shoot that same shutter speed or faster. For example, if you're shooting at 50 millimeters, bump your shutter speed up to 1/50th of a second or faster. Whereas if you're shooting at, say, 200 millimeters, bump your shutter speed up to 200 or 1/200th of a second or faster. If you're shooting slower than that, slower than your focal length that is, you might want to consider a tripod. Not that it's 100% necessary, but something to consider. I know nowadays we have all the fancy cameras with IBIS and the lenses have image stabilization and all that stuff. So it's not a hard pressed rule, but if your images are coming out blurry, then obviously something's going on here. Now let's talk practical examples. Typically portraits in studio, I'm shooting at around 1/60th of a second. Not a hard pressed rule, but it's my go-to specifically in studio because I control all of the available lighting and I'm typically not shooting anybody jumping around and running and stuff like that. So it's pretty static, pretty still images, or rather still subjects. And 160 is fast enough that I don't really have to worry about camera shake, even on a 200 millimeter, but I do often shoot on a tripod, even in studio as well. Now, if I'm going out into the world for, say, street photography or a walk around the woods, a walk around in the woods, a walkabout, let's say. Probably gonna keep it a little higher, maybe 1/250th of a second, just because I know that I'll be moving around a lot and you just never know what's gonna happen. Maybe you wanna bring that camera up really quickly. Why am I air cameraing it? But maybe you wanna bring your camera up real quick and get a photo of who knows what's going on. But 250 is a safe bet that you're probably not gonna miss anything or get any blurry shots. At least you're lessening the likelihood of doing so. Now, I do a amount of sports and wildlife photography as well. That, I'm bringing it up way higher. That being said, when I do sports and wildlife, I'm shooting on a 500 millimeter f4. So again, 1/500th of a second or higher. And I'm typically shooting at, for typical sports, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000th of a second. For wildlife stuff, maybe even higher than that, just because, again, like I said, birds are fast. Those wings are so fast. So it can be quite the challenge to freeze motion on such a long focal length like this because you need your shutter speed to be so high up, which in turn is darkening the image. So you have to find that perfect balance in the exposure triangle. But once you nail it, once you get to that sweet spot, you can get some really cool images. Now, if you're new to shooting in manual mode and you really want to experiment with adjusting your shutter speed, consider shooting on shutter priority, which is S or TV on Canon cameras. And in shutter priority, what happens is you select your shutter speed and the camera will adjust your aperture and ISO automatically to find the perfect exposure for that shutter speed. So if you're out shooting sports or wildlife and you know you want to have 1,000 or a 1,500 or a 2,000th of a second shutter speed, you leave it at that and the camera decides what to make the aperture and the ISO to try to get you the optimal exposure for the image, as opposed to you trying to finagle all your settings. And you still have the option to over or underexpose the image a little bit while maintaining that shutter speed. So it's something to play around with and get used to. And then once you feel more comfortable, jump fully into manual mode. And that's where you'll learn how your shutter speed will affect your other settings and how to go back and forth between the three aspects of the exposure triangle to really lock in the image. All right, that is shutter speed in a nutshell, guys. It's more than just a setting. It's a tool to help tell your story through your photos, whether that's freezing a split-second moment or showing motion in a frame. If you found this video helpful, go ahead and hit that like button. Maybe consider subscribing if you have not already, and drop a comment down below if you have any questions. I will be posting some more videos soon covering things like aperture and ISO, so keep an eye out for that. And thanks for watching. Now go ahead and grab your camera and go try some stuff with shutter speed. Let me know how it goes. Peace.